You're listening to Monocle on Saturday, first broadcast on the 12th of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello there, it's Emma Nelson here, coming to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday, and on today's programme we'll have a look through the week's news and culture. Founder of China Dialogue, international voice Isabel Hilton is sitting next to me. Isabel, quiet week?
I can't think anything significant happened this week. No,
excellent.
Nothing disturbed my peace.
We'll talk about what didn't happen this week, and then...
I mean, I've been in business now for nearly 17 years. And I like the fact that I've evolved, not just as an individual, but as a creative as well.
Monocle's Rory Jones hearing from the acclaimed British designer Lee Broom ahead of his exhibition at Milan's Saloni del Mobile. That's all ahead on Monocle on Saturday with me, Emma Nelson. First, a look at the headlines. Iran and the United States will hold high-level talks today aimed at jump-starting negotiations over Tehran's fast-advancing nuclear program. The US President Donald Trump is threatening military action if there is no deal. Iranian media have reported that Iran and US delegations have arrived in Oman. Russian media say a 4.5-hour-long meeting between President Putin and Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff has been held in St. Petersburg. It's believed a ceasefire in Ukraine was the main issue on the agenda. And the White House has insisted that Donald Trump's tariffs will make the US richer, despite the falling value of the dollar. It dropped yesterday to a 3-year low. There's also been another sell-off of government debt. And those are the headlines on Monocle Radio. So welcome everybody to Saturday morning here in London. Bright and sunny, an optimistic couple of days lie ahead of us here in the UK at least. Isabel Hilton, China Dialogue, and possibly the world's busiest commentator this week. Thank you for coming in, because I suspect that this morning, after what's been happening between the United States and China, you'd rather stop talking and lie under a desk.
Or stay in bed with the covers over my head. It has been a pretty hectic week, actually, yes.
As a sort of one of the most brilliant pundits on China, what was going through your head this week? Because I can only imagine that you would have a lot of people ringing you up, asking you to share your wisdom. But the fact remains is two things. A, we don't know really what Donald Trump's playing at. And B, this stuff happens so fast that when people are looking at you for a little bit of wisdom and a little bit of clarity, where do you actually go and find it?
Well, it's partly that I've looked at China over a long time, and I have a reasonable sense of how they will react to certain provocations. And that's rooted in a long-term suspicion of the United States, a long-term message to their own people that the US is trying to limit China's rise. And the sense that, if you talk very disparagingly about the leaders of other countries, as Donald Trump did this week, there is no way Xi Jinping is going to line up with the other countries that Donald Trump says were trying to kiss his rear end. That you just know that's not going to happen. So I read the Chinese press. I obviously, look at what China's saying about this. We can't guess what Donald Trump is going to do because, it doesn't make any sense, and he might do something completely different 10 seconds later. But you can get a reasonable sense of things China at least won't do. It's not going to give in to bullying. It's going to count the weapons in its locker, deploy them selectively. So, those things one does know, and then after that it's about monitoring the details of the reaction.
And you said that, in the years that you've been a China watcher, is there context or is there anything that has happened before which could suggest the way that this thing's going to play out? Because Donald Trump is a major, he's the unpredictable element in all of this. But countries tend to react in a way that is recognisable. So is there anything that we could look to?
Well, I'd say two things about that. We have had Trump 1. We had the first presidency, the beginning of the use of trade as a weaponizing kind of America's great economic power. And since then, China has been trying to reduce its dependence on the US. It's been finding other outlets for its goods. It's been building up its own resilience. So there is a kind of degree of preparedness in China. But in the longer term and the more sort of cultural aspect of this, it has been since 1989 the major kind of propaganda point for the party to the people that China was a great country, that foreigners brought China down, that the party will make China great again, and that today this is a historic moment when Western liberal democracy has peaked and is in decline, and it's China's moment. So the party can say to the people, we told you that there was a hostile environment. It can blame anything that goes wrong in China today on the United States instead of it being laid at the door of the party. And that's a tremendous asset. And it can call on people to suffer and fight because that appeals to the patriotic spirit of the Chinese. And that way it can last out a lot of hostility.
And how is this playing out on the streets, in shops and in businesses in China? I mean, we saw a couple of weeks ago, Canada stripped its shelves of Californian wine.
Yeah. You're getting very much the same thing. Because the other thing is that this is playing into a moment in China when China is kind of technologically pretty much matching up to the United States in lots of consumer goods. A lot of the consumer electronics that people buy in the US, of course, are made in China. And China now has smartphones, which certainly rival Apple smartphones. It has electric vehicles which are better than Tesla. So you've got a kind of patriotic wave of, people conspicuously ditching their Apple phones. And you've seen there are videos of retailers stripping the shelves of Apple phones, putting Xiaomi instead. You've got signs going up in shops in Shanghai saying, we will charge American customers a surcharge. If you have a complaint about this, please refer yourself to the American consulate. And so, you can see it playing out. They're having an absolute ball. And on the Chinese internet, these short videos satirizing the United States, satirizing the idea that American workers can cope with contemporary industrial production, which is in any event largely done by robots. So you've got these videos of Donald Trump and his entire cabinet trying to assemble sneakers, or there's one pretty grotesque one of Donald Trump in a dress dancing with Elon Musk dressed in ladies' underwear. So they're having a lot of fun on the Chinese internet.
Thankfully, I've missed that one. The one that we have seen that is absolutely everywhere is the one where they've superimposed people, Trump and Rubio and Hex's heads onto workers trying to stitch stuff together in a factory. Yes. And actually, when I was watching it, I thought this isn't mocking Donald Trump. This is mocking America.
It's utterly mocking America. Yeah.
One wonders how much of an effect that will have on Americans. Maybe the people who are being mocked are not the kind of people who are watching this on social media. We don't know. But if that were another country mocking me in that way, I'd be cross with Donald Trump. I wouldn't be cross with China.
Well, the problem with what Donald Trump appears to be trying to do, insofar as one can discern any settled intention, he seems to be trying to revive an idea of industrial production that goes back to the 1950s. And it's just not like that anymore. China isn't a country which depends on low-wage, low-value manufacture. It has the most advanced factories in the world. It has superbly organised supply chains. It's a kind of different universe. So the mockery is partly of this kind of backward vision of, let's have coal and steel kind of vision that Donald Trump is projecting. And it's just, they just find it, bewildering and certainly worthy of satire. And if you remember, as far as, how Americans feel about that, I agree with you. And do you remember when there was a suggestion that TikTok would be banned? There was a whole wave of what were called TikTok refugees, which went to a Chinese version. TikTok's all Chinese already, but there is another Chinese kind of short video program that they app that people then downloaded, and there was a tremendous celebration in China welcoming American TikTok refugees. So in terms of that kind of psychological propaganda war, I think China's winning this point.
It has a self-assuredness to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Speaking of which, there's a really good article in the New York Times which talked about the pinch point, and actually it's mirrored in a good article in The Guardian that I'll bring everyone's attention to. So Trump showed his pain point in his standoff with China as a headline in the New York Times. It says, Xi Jinping, who rules with absolute authority, has shown he's willing to let the Chinese people endure hardship. President Trump revealed he has limits. And this was to do with the fact that Trump blinked on Wednesday when it came to the imposition of terribly punishing tariffs on so many countries, obviously singling out China as the country that he would not back down on. In fact, the numbers went up and up and up in terms of the percentage points of how much of a tariff would be imposed on anything from China being imported into the United States. China, on the other hand, has not backed down at all on any point. And in The Guardian this week, they've been talking about how there's one article which mentions the fact that this could be, dare we say it, the kind of Vietnam moment when Nixon wouldn't back down when it came to Vietnam and the Vietnam War. And there's a moment when neither side can walk away from this with any kind of either self-respect or anything intact, that damage is done. And one wonders, have we hit that point now that China will just keep ramping up those tariff percentages, and we don't know what Donald Trump is going to do?
China said yesterday that the numbers would not go on going up and that China was always ready to talk. But I think that what you want to look at is the conditions under which any talks might take place. There is, in my view, no question that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump will meet. Donald Trump was talking about what a great friend Xi Jinping was. That is going to be received with a few raised eyebrows in Beijing. And Xi Jinping will be maintaining his national dignity. If those two are to meet at all, it's going to have to be Donald Trump in kind of supplicant mode going to Beijing. But what might happen over time is that they will have some quiet expert meetings where they try to lower the tone and manage the problem. China's position as of today is that we didn't seek this fight. We will fight to the death if you want to, but we always keep the door open for a reasonable conversation. That the conditions under which that conversation could take place don't seem to me to be present right now, but they might well be when the prices go up on the shelves in the United States, because as the piece in the Times said, China has a much greater capacity to ask for sacrifice and suffering for the nation from its own people. The Chinese people have been through this many times, whereas the American people, they were promised a better life. They were promised better conditions. They were promised better jobs by Donald Trump. When they find that those, are not materializing, they're already angry. The town hall meetings that we've seen in the past week or so have been extremely angry. So it seems to me, at least Beijing is going to guess that Trump is more vulnerable than Beijing is. And I think that calculation is actually right, because the great gift that Donald Trump has given to Xi Jinping is that whatever goes wrong in the Chinese economy or in Chinese society now is going to be the fault of Donald Trump and not the party.
We've spoken so many times in the past about the world's dependence on Chinese exports, and it was not necessarily seen as a good thing. Globalization allowed us to have lots of cheap things really quickly, but in the same time allowed China effectively to look at the ideas, copy them and make them much more cheap. And then when they decided that they didn't need the BMW factory anymore to learn from, out they went. Or, things were made more difficult. If we look in the long term of this, is there any benefit to reducing Chinese exports?
Well, China's priced itself out already of that first wave of exports, the low added value exports. So what you're looking at now is a slightly different problem. As China's moved up the technology chain and the value chain, you're looking at the kind of basis of Western economies being undermined. And that is definitely a problem. There is a systemic problem with China. And you only have to look at Germany to see it very, very clearly. So the European Union, which again is talking to China rather more actively than it was before Donald Trump's assault on the global economy, is very wary about that aspect of China. And so I think what we're likely to see is a kind of reverse effect. So when Western companies first went to China, they were quite heavily restricted in what they could do. Their money was welcome. Their intellectual property was very welcome. Now that China, for example, makes superior electric vehicles, you see factories being opened in Hungary, for example, where Chinese intellectual property is, in command. And it seems to me that it's time for the Western industrial economies to adopt Chinese rules, in the sense that if China wants to produce goods in Europe, in France or Germany or Hungary, it has to transfer intellectual property. There are controls on things like where the data goes, which are the controls that, for example, Beijing insists that Tesla operate under in China. So there are rules that China made for itself, which were greatly beneficial to Chinese industry and the economy, that China's partners should now impose on China. And then you do get a kind of balancing of benefit and get tough on those subsidies, get tough on that protected market. And so, you can see a new phase of this conversation opening, which is more of a conversation between equals.
Isabel, stay with us. We'll be back with you in a minute to maybe look at some non-China related news. I'm not quite sure if that actually exists at the moment. Let's head now to Salone del Mobile. Yadro is a global name in artistic porcelain, and it's just introduced a new lighting collection created in collaboration with the British designer Lee Broom. It's called Cascade, and it's inspired by traditional paper lanterns. Well, Monocle's Rory Jones sat down with Lee ahead of Salone del Mobile to talk about his new collection.
It's a difficult one because it has evolved over the years. I mean, I've been in business now for nearly 17 years. So when I look back from when I first started and I look back to now, it feels like a different designer altogether. And I like the fact that I've evolved, not just as an individual, but as a creative as well. I would say essentially, though, there is always something that runs through my work, and that is a sense of looking to some sort of craft or technique to bring into my piece, and usually from the past. And then I want to reinterpret that in very contemporary and modernist ways. So I guess if you were to look at my work, you'd essentially say that I am a modernist, but there is always something there that stems from the past.
So moving on to this collaboration with Yadro that you're working on, you brought up the past there. How does this share the DNA of the things you've done before? What are you bringing to Yadro, and what are they providing to you that fits with your style?
Well, Yadro is a company that's kind of steeped in heritage, and obviously the very nature of creating porcelain is a very traditional technique. And that really fascinated me. So it's a real craft, and the people that work there are craftspeople. And essentially you're working with a kind of live material that sort of changes, and it sort of does its own thing. It's very unpredictable when it's been fired. So I was very interested in creating something that was incredibly contemporary, very modernist, but using this very traditional material.
What was difficult about working with porcelain?
Well, the first thing that was difficult is that I designed a piece that has lots of horizontal lines, lots of spherical shapes, and lots of sort of clean symmetry. Things that need to kind of have balance, they need to marry up. There isn't a lot of room for tolerances. And essentially, it really is a live material. It shrinks when you fire it, so it's very unpredictable. It doesn't get a lot of detail. Sometimes in the mold, it can crack or it won't show all the detail. And my work is all about precision. So to get that with porcelain is very difficult. And they are brilliant at that factory. And there's so many trials and so many developments of it. And they've managed to crack it, no pun intended.
And a bit about yourself. You obviously have a background in fashion, perhaps in forms of shape and silhouette. Do you still find that informs your work?
I think that fashion does inform my work. I don't purposefully channel it necessarily, but because I was trained in fashion, I was trained in Central St. Martin's and I studied women's wear, and I worked for Vivienne Westwood for a time. So, those formative years, whatever you're doing then really sort of like instills everything you do from then on. And so for me now, I definitely approach my work, I guess, still from a kind of fashion point of view. As a designer, I like to challenge myself every year. I like to develop with new materials, with new silhouettes, with new mediums, but have an overarching house style. And that is kind of more synonymous with fashion in a way. I think it's more unusual in design. There are a lot of brands that sort of stick to what they know is tried and tested. And obviously, the whole process of interiors is much slower than fashion. So you can't be reinventing yourself every year. But I do like to challenge myself and the team and keep things interesting and just explore as much as I can whilst keeping within sort of my own design ethos, I guess.
That slowness in design versus fashion, do you find that you are more suited to this now? Do you find that you are more efficient in a way of thinking than you were perhaps when you were younger working on fashion?
I've definitely learned to accept this pace and that things are slower. I am incredibly impatient and I'm constantly trying to get things done as quick as we can. I mean, you could be sitting on a product for 5 years, trying to execute it to the exact way that you want it to be. And I'm not saying that we cut any corners, we don't. I think generally for us, it takes around 2 years, which is pretty standard from the inception of the idea to the point when it starts to go into production. Things are faster now, even in interiors, and you only have to look at social media to see that, you can put a rendering up and not know if it's real or not. And, there you have a product, it's out there. So if you're creating things in a 3-dimensional form, you have to really kind of like, I think if you're committed to an idea and a project, get it done. But obviously, we are very, very cautious. And with a lot of my work, I want to eliminate the screws and eliminate the seams and make things as clean as possible. It's about the things that you can't see that are important to me, just as well as the things that you can. So to do that, you also have to take your time.
If you could humor me, where does the average person miss the trick when it comes to lighting? What is your definition of lighting?
The biggest flaw, I guess, that I see if I go into people's homes with lighting is scale. I think people are very afraid to sort of use scale in a bigger sense. For me, the ceiling is the only area that has this light fixture. All the walls, all the floors are littered with wall coverings, carpets, furniture, artwork, whatever it might be. The ceiling is pretty much usually bare. So you have an opportunity to create not just an item that serves function, but something that kind of says something, a conversation piece. It could be very sculptural, treat it almost like as an art piece that also incorporates lighting, and go larger. You don't have to go small, even in a small space. That's my key thing. And then quite obvious, but not to everybody, is, make sure that your lights are dimmable. I think everything needs to be kind of dimmed down to a very nice temperature, depending on what the day is. Yeah, what the time of day is.
Lee Broom there giving us some very valuable advice about how to sort out your lights in your house, not least because he's created a very beautiful collection for Milan Design Week. The idea of making things dimmable, it's a bit of a thing in our house, is making things dimmable. How about you, Isabel? Yes. But also quite needing a bright light to read with.
I do love, there are lights which are very expensive, but I find them very effective. Reading lights are pretty. Our house is mined with reading lights because we both read, and we both our eyes are not 20 years old anymore, so we do need them. Yeah.
Indeed, I think the sun's getting dimmer. Let's talk about some other stuff that we've noticed in the press. Speaking of books, this is a very, very sad story. And we're trying to keep things chipper, but we're finding it hard. The New York Times has this article about the purge of books from the Naval Academy Library in the United States. And they have very simply said that anything which is critical of racism is gone, but anything that defends white power is there. And they've obviously gone and cleared the shelves. And a really simple example right at the top of the article is Gone is I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, Maya Angelou's transformative best-selling memoir chronicling struggles with racism and trauma. Gone is memorialising the Holocaust, but kept 2 copies of Mein Kampf. Now, Isabel, as a judge of a very good book award and the owner of Bright Lights in the House, in order to preserve this love of reading. This is serious, isn't it?
Oh, God. The extraordinary thing about what's happening in the United States is that, this is stuff that I don't remember from the 1930s, but I have read about from the 1930s. The Nazis famously burned books. Authoritarian regimes famously burned books. And this is beyond parody. I'm reduced to sort of gibbering on the sidelines that you see this list. And it is like a kind of, it's as, if you'd asked a child to characterise hard right authoritarianism, this would be it. And this is for the Navy. So what are they trying to do to the armed forces? That this is, their required or suggested reading. The Bell Curve, that's a notorious book which is still there. That's the book that argued that black men and women are genetically less intelligent than white people. A critique of that book is no longer there. So they're not just leaving these toxic texts in place. You could argue that, one shouldn't ban any book, but the criticism of them, the analysis of them, the counter-argument, that's what's gone, and that's the mark of serious authoritarianism.
I'm not sure who is actually telling the library to choose which books, because it says in response to an order by the Office of Pete Hegseth, civilian Navy officials took the books that were removed from the academy. This order is this part of this broader removal of diversity policy, and this is when you see the tiny example which the micro reflects the macro here, that if you take a copy of I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings off a bookshelf and yet you keep 2 copies of Mein Kampf, it very, very elegantly and devastatingly explains just how this stuff works on ground and at a granular level.
Absolutely, and it's being justified as complying with directives outlined in executive orders issued by the president, and that's another mark of top-down authoritarianism. That an executive order against diversity and inclusion is signed, and then it's interpreted all the way down the chain until you get to the library shelf. And in order to be seen to comply, or because there's uncertainty about where the line is, people tend to over obey. It's the preemptive cringe. And if you remember, in the first Trump presidency, one of the foci of resistance, actually, to this kind of approach was in the Librarians of America, who turned out to be, a pretty formidable collection of ladies of a certain age.
I've been a librarian.
Yeah, and they took no prisoners first time round. So in the public libraries, I will be interested to see if anything, happens there.
Let's turn our attention finally, though, to Germany, which got itself a pretty stable, and people are already criticising it for its dullness. Its coalition arrived this week. Finally, took a little bit of time to get together, but by all accounts, that's a perfectly usual pace for Germany. Elections in February, coalition formed in April, everything kicks off in May. But the whole purpose of this was to keep the far right out. The Alternative für Deutschland polled the highest it has ever polled. It for the first time, an opinion poll placed AfD ahead of both of the CDU and the SPD, centre-right, centre-left. Yet the firewall was strengthened this week. And so you have arguably the place where all this happened, being absolutely clear and certain that the future does not include fascism and does not include the far right.
Well, and in fact, the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who was so enraged by Elon Musk's support of AfD that he made some, extremely robust remarks like never again fascism in Germany. And I think that although he was accused of having a wobble with regards to the AfD in an earlier vote, this time round, in the 6 weeks of coalition negotiations, as you say, the firewall is absolutely robust. What will happen to German voters, how German voters will move over the next few years is a worry. There may come a point where they finally do predominate, but amongst the measures that Merz is put in place in the outgoing government, where he had a 2/3 majority that he needed in order to get this through, was to lift the debt brake. So he has a lot of money to play with. So there's going to be a lot of investment in Germany. The trains might run on time again. Germans have been very, very cross about the state of the railways. So all those things could be crowd pleasers.
I hope that we're ending there on some sort of positive note, that maybe the trains will run on time again in Germany. Thank you so much, Isabel Hilton. That's all the time we have for today's episode of Monocle on Saturday. Thanks to Isabel, and also to the producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan. Monocle on Saturday returns next week, and I'll be back with Monocle on Sunday tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great weekend.